for sure, and the coffee. So now we'll get to more serious stuff, and I'd like to give the floor to our deputy mayor from the city of Thessaloniki, Mr. Koukas.
Thank you, and good morning to all. A warm welcome to the online roof transnational meeting that we are virtually hosting in Thessaloniki. We're very glad that you could make it, and we hope that you will find the presentations that will follow on housing policies and solutions in Greece useful and interesting. We will also get a chance to have a deeper look into the measures we are taking in Thessaloniki in combating homelessness and housing exclusion. I would like to note two important points regarding the local action plan we are developing on social and affordable housing and combating homelessness. The first aspect is that the action plan focuses on addressing structural problems that impact access to housing in the city. It is important to address the social needs and conditions of individuals, but we cannot ignore the structural conditions that create and sustain exclusion. Therefore, we are primarily developing measures to combat lack of social and affordable housing in the city. At the center of our action plan, then, is to create a pool of social and affordable housing stock that will be managed by local authorities through the creation of a social rental agency. The second aspect that I would like to point to is the aspect of data-driven policy making. We are undertaking a number of steps in order to base our policy development process on updated and real data that reflects the situations at hand. We will have the opportunity to hear later about the citywide study that we conducted for this specific purpose. And beyond that, you will also have the opportunity from a distance to get familiar with the interventions of the municipality of Thessaloniki to combat homelessness and support homeless persons. You will also see and hear personal accounts of homelessness from persons receiving street work support, as well as those who have left homelessness behind. So I would like to thank you all for your eager participation and wish for a productive and interesting transnational meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koukas. Yes, so I think this is also a very good introduction to what is to come afterwards, and it gives you also a very, like a summary of an idea of what we are focusing on in the city of Thessaloniki in terms of the strategic focus that we have on alleviating homelessness. So now we will move on to a very, very short audio listening, which is Phoebe's account. She was homeless and she has gone through most of the services in the city. And she's currently very actively also involved in combating homelessness and in several networks. And we thank her for her contribution. It's short and it's audio. You can read the translation on the screen.
Η αστεγία για μένα είναι μια εμπειρία που με έκανε να καταλάβω πόσο ρευστές και αβέβαιες είναι οι καταστάσεις γενικότερα. Πόσο εύκολο είναι να ανατραπεί η ζωή κάποιου. Είναι όπως ένα σχολείο, αλλά από τα παλιά σχολεία που δεν παρήχαν και την καλύτερη εμπειρία στο μαθητή και το γέμισαν με τραύματα και φόβους. Πάντα υπάρχει ο φόβος ότι θα ξαναβρεθώ στην ίδια κατάσταση. ότι θα φτάσω στα γεράματα και θα είμαι στο δρόμο. Θα μπορούσα να πω με τα βεβαιότητας ότι ήταν για μένα και ένα τεστ χαρακτήρα, το να σταθώ στα πόδια μου χωρίς να ενδώσω στη κοινική μου πλευρά και την κακία.
So yes, this was Phoebe's short contribution. And I'd like to ask if Nana from Arsis is ready to present, to have a zoom in basically on the street work that Arsis does. Arsis is a member, is an NGO, a large NGO based in several cities, also active internationally. And they're a very active ULG member. They will also be our partner in implementing the SSA. And they are also collaborating with the municipality on several actions, including street work. So Nana, will you be able to share the video and your comments?
Good morning. Wait a minute to share my screen with you. Okay. So we choose to show you a video from the job of our street work teams on the field. This is the place of our social service. Our social service is a place where people who need help come voluntarily and with the support of counselors try to find ways to deal with the difficulties they experience. It is also the place where our mobile unit of urgent psychosocial support is housed. The team of the mobile unit implements outreach interventions, home visits as well, as actions and interventions within the social service area. Here we see the preparations of our normal day. The team is started to go out. It's a rainy day on Thessaloniki. And they go to distribute blankets and basic necessities to people we work with. Έλα. Μμμ. Μμμ. Μμ. 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 Να ακούγεται. Δεν ξέρω τι να κάνω. Ναι.
And then, Nana, try to unmute and take off your earphones so at least we can hear the whole video. Like this, and then take off the earphones and turn it up. Never mind, we'll read it through. No worries.
We are very sorry with the problem. We try to find a solution, but I understand that probably you didn't hear nothing.
It was very low, but we had the subtitles, so it was okay.
Okay. Now we see shots from the work of the colleagues on the street. As you can see, we often, in order to get to know the children better, we use juice, we offer juice or a meal or something similar. We do the same with adults on the street. It helps a lot to start the discussion by offering something. I would also like to know that from the beginning of the year and until September, we found on the street 194 unaccompanied minors. We had these technical difficulties, and I don't know if it was possible to give you a little taste of street work and the situation on the streets of Thessaloniki. I can also send you photos of a Belgian photographer who spent a few days with the colleagues on the street. And I think it is also interesting to observe his experience. I don't know how it was for you.
I think it was a very interesting video because it gives also a taste of, and we can see that, I mean, for me, a lot of the people that I saw on the streets were also people, I cross these people very, very often. And there's also the dimension of unaccompanied minors. I mean, this kind of the more invisible homelessness and rooflessness that a lot of people don't come across and don't know about. So the video was interesting in revealing that aspect as well. I was wondering if anybody has any questions for Nana, or any clarifications that they would like.
Nana, for me, it was quite impressive to see the sort of structures where the people that you filmed live in. So it is as if they are actually building these temporary homes from stuff that you find around, but it's very visible. It's very obvious, not that the person lived there in these kind of conditions, but it's also, let's say it's less temporary than when you see someone just sitting with a few things. They actually have a sort of home. So I was wondering if this kind of structure, this kind of people, how much are they willing or would like to go out of this situation? No, because it has the feeling that they are building themselves a sort of way of living. So just about your approach with these people.
Okay. Θα το πω στα ελληνικά για να το αποτυπώσω με όλη την σιγουριά που θέλω να έχω ότι το απέδωσα σωστά. Yes, Merit, you can help me. Νομίζω ότι είναι μια πολύ καλή ερώτηση αυτή που κάνετε, καθώς είναι ένα μεγάλο θέμα συζήτησης στο κατά πόσο οι άνθρωποι επιθυμούν να μετακινηθούν από τα σημεία στα οποία βρίσκονται.
I think your question is very, very pertinent because it is a huge question whether these people do want to change their situation or move out of the situation that they're in.
Ωστόσο, νομίζω ότι αυτό μπορούμε να το κουβεντιάσουμε όταν και εφόσον πρώτα ως κράτος πια μπορούμε να παρέχουμε αυτές τις στεγαστικές επιλογές, τόσες μάλλον στεγαστικές επιλογές που να απαντούν στις εξατομικευμένες ανάγκες του καθενός, και μετά να μπορούμε όντως να δούμε ποιοι άνθρωποι δεν επιθυμούν να μετακινηθούν.
However, we can only answer this question if the state can provide viable housing options which can respond to individual needs and tailored needs of homeless persons. And then we can discuss and ask whether these people would choose one of the options or not choose that option.
Επίσης, όντως είδαμε κάποιες εικόνες από άστεγους ανθρώπους που τα σημεία διαμονής τους είναι πραγματικά πολύ φανερά. Αλλά είναι σημαντικό να έχουμε στο νου μας ότι δεν είναι ο πληθυσμός των αστέγων τόσο ορατός στην πόλη. Δηλαδή, ένα μικρό νούμερο μπορούμε να το δούμε σε μια βόλτα μας στην πόλη. Όλοι οι υπόλοιποι κάπως φροντίζουν και είναι σε σημεία που δεν είναι τόσο εύκολα προσβάσιμα, καθώς είναι η καθημερινότητά τους στο δρόμο και κάπως θέλουν να νιώθουν και οι ίδιοι προστατευμένοι.
You saw from some of the images that some of the structures or where the homeless were staying on the street were in public places or accessible places. But the truth is that the majority of the roofless persons are in kind of invisibility. I mean, they are not in public areas and we cannot easily access them. They're not accessible. And in a way, it's a way of, they will be on the streets during the day or in public places during the day, but they have, let's say, a safe corner, a safe space that they have created, which is beyond the visibility of the public.
Thank you. Thank you. Dominique had a question, I think.
Yes, I didn't really understood that concerning the minors. You said that they were at this police station for 3 months. But now it's not doing that at the same time. But what is the alternative? Are they housed somewhere else? And what are they identified as minors? Or because we have the same problem in France, in Toulouse, we have the municipality, we are housing 80 minors. In fact, they declare themselves minors, but it is during the procedure to check if they are really minors or adults. So do you do the same?
Okay. Θα τα πω. Μέριτς, πάλι θα με βοηθήσεις. I'm gonna ask for your help. Λοιπόν, καταρχάς, για να απαντάω και σε αυτό που ρωτήσατε, αλλά και στις ερωτήσεις που βλέπω να έρχονται για τους ασυνόδευτους ανήλικους. Εμείς συνεργαζόμαστε με οποιονδήποτε ασυνόδευτο ανήλικο εντοπίσουμε στον δρόμο, είτε έχει έγγραφα, είτε όχι. Όντως, στο προηγούμενο καθεστώς της προστατευτικής φύλαξης, τα παιδιά μένανε για 3 τουλάχιστον μήνες σε χώρους εντός των κρατητηρίων της αστυνομίας. Ευτυχώς, αυτό είναι μια ευχάριστη εξέλιξη, αυτό άλλαξε από τις αρχές, από τον Ιανουάριο του 2021 και πλέον οι ασυνόδευτοι ανήλικοι που εντοπίζονται στον δρόμο μετακινούνται αμέσως, χωρίς να χρειαστεί να περάσουν από τα κρατητήρια, σε ειδικές δομές φιλοξενίας που υπάρχουν στις παρυφές της Θεσσαλονίκης, δηλαδή σε κοντινές αποστάσεις.
So we work with any unaccompanied minor, meaning, regardless of their legal status, whether they have papers or they don't. And it's true that they were held in police custody for up to 3 months in the past, but it was a very good change, a positive change since January 2021. That's when an accompanied minor is identified on the street. They're directly referred to special shelters, which are in the periphery of Thessaloniki and close to the city.
Και νομίζω ρωτάτε κιόλας, είναι η διαμονή τους σε αυτές τις δομές, έτσι κι αλλιώς είναι κάτι που, δηλαδή είναι προστατευμένα τα παιδιά όσο είναι εκεί, από τη στιγμή που θα μπουν όμως στη δομή φιλοξενίας. Κατά τα άλλα, ήταν ένα πάρα πολύ συχνό φαινόμενο να έχουμε παιδιά με τα οποία εμείς ξεκινάμε μια συνεργασία και υποστηρίζονται και νομικά για τα έγγραφά τους και όλα τα σχετικά, αλλά κάποια στιγμή απλά στο προηγούμενη φάση, πριν μεταφερθούν σε κάποια δομή φιλοξενίας και πριν μπουν στην προστατευτική φύλαξη, ξαφνικά να εξαφανιστούν και να μας πάρουν, για παράδειγμα, ένα τηλέφωνο κάποια στιγμή από την Τουρκία, από κάπου αλλού, σε απελπιστική κατάσταση, λέγοντάς μας ότι απλά μεταφέρθηκαν πίσω, γιατί δεν είχαν έγγραφα. Αυτό συμβαίνει στις περιπτώσεις παιδιών που δεν έχουν έγγραφα, φυσικά.
Of course, when the unaccompanied minors are transferred to a shelter and they are protected and they're provided with all the protection, we work with them before they are transferred, and during our work we support them through their legalization process and provide them legal support to get papers. but very often before they are moved, we have some of our beneficiaries, children, where they call us in a desperate state from Turkey, let's say, that they have been deported. So this is something that we face very often.
Thank you. We are a little bit behind on time, but there are 2 questions in the chat.
One more question, I think, from Stephen, which is if these structures of homeless, like these little self-made homes, are allowed permanently, or if the police comes and removes them.
Είναι επίσης, δεν υπάρχει αυτή τη στιγμή νόμος, από ό,τι γνωρίζουμε τουλάχιστον, που να απαγορεύει τη διαμονή σε δημόσιους χώρους. Ωστόσο, είναι πάρα πολύ συχνό φαινόμενο. Όντως, αυτές οι κατασκευές των σπιτιών που έχουν κάνει από μόνοι τους οι άνθρωποι, πολλές φορές να τις χαλούν. Τώρα δεν μπορώ να πω ότι τις χαλάει η αστυνομία ή τις χαλάνε οι πολίτες, ωστόσο είναι ένα γεγονός ότι καταστρέφονται και οι άνθρωποι αναγκάζονται να μετακινηθούν σε άλλα μέρη.
So legally, there is no, like, let's say, framework that allows for such an intervention to kind of destroy, let's say, the self-made homes. But we do come across very often these structures that have been removed or have been destroyed, etc. But we don't know if it's the police or if it's citizens or, from the neighborhood, basically. So most of the people do actually get into a situation where they have to move somewhere else because their self-made shelter has been destroyed.
Επίσης, έχει τύχει πολλές φορές οι άνθρωποι να απομακρύνονται, εντάξει, όχι με βίαιο τρόπο, αλλά να τους ζητείτε επισταμένως η απομάκρυνσή τους από τα σημεία που διαμένουν και να μετακινηθούν κάπου αλλού. Κάτι που δυσκολεύει την καθημερινότητά τους, γιατί κάπως χτίζουν ένα δίκτυο, πώς να το πω, υποστηρικτικού δικτύου στο κάθε σημείο διαμονής που ο καθένας επιλέγει.
So we do also come across people being moved, maybe not always violently, but being pushed away from the place that they have chosen as their space, which is very difficult for them because wherever they choose is something where they create networks. They know it. They do create a kind of home in that place. So this is a difficulty we come across often.
Could I add something more?
Sure.
We as ARSIS believe that the state should ensure also that there are housing options specialized for people with mental health disabilities or with issues of substance use. And through all this procedure, we need to listen to people's needs and people's decisions of themselves, and to adapt our tools according to all this, and not to ask the people themselves to be adapted to these tools. We need to give them options to make them feel acceptable.
Yes, I think, Anastasia, it's a good point, and I think this is what Housing First aims to do. And we hope that through our SSA, which you will hear about also in the afternoon, we will do, let's say, we will try to integrate that into existing homelessness programs. So thank you very much, Nana and Anastasia, both of you, and Arsis. So I think we can move on to the next point, which is, we don't have a break yet, right? Or do we?
No. We go ahead first.
We just started.
Thank you, Nana and Anastasia. Thank you. So interesting.
So now we will have a very interesting presentation by Dimitra Siatitsa. She, I have to say, apart from having a very strong grasp of the, theoretical, historical context, has also been working in the field on homelessness and on housing as well. And we collaborate also closely with Dimitra in whatever we're doing in Thessaloniki. She's also involved in designing the business and operational plan for our social rental agency. So she has, let's say, both hats and both aspects and the grasp of it. So I'm very happy that you're here today. Dimitra. Thank you very much.
Hello, Merit. Hello, everyone. I'm also very happy to be here. We have been following the ROOF local meetings, and so now here is the international one. I have been asked to give you a more historical perspective on housing. So somehow now I will take you from the ground to the broader picture of housing policies and its development, and of the housing issue in Greece, let's see, and how it's perceived. So it's not going to be small scale, and I will be mostly referring to the housing sector. So let me start. Let's see how I will share my screen. Okay. Okay. So is it okay now?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Good. So just to place a little bit Greece in the different housing models in Europe, it's usually it's part of the southern, let's say, European housing system. So we have very high rates of home ownership. We have a quite limited rental sector, but as you maybe already have understood, and is an important one for particularly because it concentrates a lot of vulnerabilities. And it's also, let's say, one of the fields where social policies are implemented. I will return to that. So it's quite important, though limited. Generally, Southern European countries have very low social rental sectors. In Greece, I will mention it again, we have no social rental sector, which is quite a peculiarity of Greece. Also, in this housing system, beyond high rates of home ownership, we do have very high rates of second housing, multiple ownership. So families and households would invest as an asset to property. And of course, this creates also a kind of abundant housing stock and a lot of vacancies, which again is, let's say, another direction for housing policy today. Also, the social state has been weak in general, but particularly in housing, it has been family, the main support, let's say, structure that provided for its members. And another issue has been that housing has been, through history, a motor for economic development. So according to the situation and economic cycle and condition, state policies would boost the activity in the housing construction sector, not for providing indirectly providing housing, but also mainly to develop labor positions, economic activity, etc. To go back a little bit to the history, the roots, let's say, of public intervention in housing in Greece starts in the 20s, when public direct state intervention was mobilized to house the massive population influx of refugees of Greek origin from Minor Asia. And it was at that time when a lot of public bodies and mechanisms and tools and laws were developed for producing complexes, let's say, in a more in the more classical standard understanding of social housing production, post-war housing production in Europe, in most European countries. However, this path was not, let's say, followed. Although at the beginning there was a kind of intensive production of collective housing and organized housing, it gradually became more marginal, and what prevailed was a set of direct and indirect state aids for accessing home ownership. And actually also these complexes that were produced for refugee housing and later on for workers, they were granted for private ownership. They didn't remain in the hands of any public entity. I want to say also that this choice, let's say, was quite, it was very conscious and quite ideologically loaded at that time, at the post-war and post-Civil War period, where promoting home ownership was a kind also a tool for keeping social cohesion, social consensus, social control, and it was very much supported also by, let's say, techniques of post-war destruction management through the Marshall Program, as it has been shown. So it has been, it hasn't been that natural as it may seem today. So access to affordable housing for the people, for the let's say the big percentage of the population, was mainly done through rapid urbanization processes and mechanisms of housing production. So it was a massive, let's say, as I said, housing construction was a motor for the economy, and through various ways of urban expansion and densification, people had managed to access housing. So it was not, let's say, it was an indirect way of providing for housing. State had a role, an active role in securing that these mechanisms would work, and it was quite protected also from, let's say, big capital or banks. So it all worked with a small capital, and it also had quite a social dispersion. So this, let's say, means that public housing, social housing policies had a quite limited importance. So this leaves us that today that there's a zero social housing stock, that at any non-public or non-profit body, and not even, let's say, insurance companies or public bodies that would develop or cooperatives that developed in other countries. Also, I will come back to that, how we ended here, but today there is no public body explicitly responsible for housing policy. It's a very fragmented within the central state, very weak at the local state. Access to housing is generally perceived as an individual and family matter, which for me is also a problem in terms of communicating and gaining a common understanding about why public intervention is needed. And this is an issue we also, I mean, Thessaloniki is also facing in its effort to, let's say, upscale and advance in the housing policy. And also historically, there has been a disconnection of social and public interest goals from other urban and spatial interventions, such as urban regeneration projects, energy upgrading funds. All these are not connected with social goals. So this makes it difficult to conceive how the state can intervene. So what mainly developed was, as I said, was supported access to owner occupation through fiscal or urban planning measures. So access to owner occupation has been, let's say, funded, state funded in a way. The state has also developed throughout the year a quite efficient mechanisms for intervening in emergency situations. So there is a kind of know-how to respond, and a framework, also a legal framework to respond to natural disasters, or in cases of housing crisis, as was in the 20s for refugees, or later on for repatriates. And anyway, with the ad hoc measures and quite limited, let's say, a limited in time and span provision to accommodate again and some crises. And generally, until at least before the crisis, the issue of services, of care services for vulnerable groups was rather a philanthropic issue. Several institutes, the church, institutions, the church, etc., would have some activity. But it was not, let's say, something very much it was not very regulated, and it was something that the state would fund in a way, but not control very much. This gradually changed since the 90s, and was very much, and the state, let's say, involvement and local state involvement in care and service provision for homeless and other vulnerable groups was reformed in a way since the crisis, where needs grew extremely. So the crisis and the austerity period, we're actually still in an austerity period, despite the expansion that was allowed for the COVID pandemic, also impacted very much the capacity of the state, let's say, to implement policies, but also the mentality about what policy intervention in housing is. Of course, housing hardship increased dramatically during that period. It was mainly an issue of income shrinkage and massive unemployment at that time. So all previous mechanisms of support, let's say, collapsed in a way. This put a lot of pressure and a lot of demand for services. The public debt management policies, however, had a kind of contradictory effect by dismantling even more a very residual state mechanism in a period where it was very much needed. So at that time, it was when the last body that somehow had a kind of social housing function, although not in the way it is understood, quite limited for specific beneficiaries, but still it would implement some housing programs. The Workers' Housing Organization was abolished in 2012. There was a sharp increase in property taxation to repay the debt. That's how it was framed. But this, of course, burdened very much small property and small owners, which, as I said, is socially very dispersed, and put a lot of pressure and, let's say, intensified indebtedness and difficulties to sustain a living. And of course, what became very central in the discourse, in the policy efforts, was the household debt management framework, as during that period, the non-performing loans, people that could no longer pay their mortgages, or that accumulated debt because they could no longer cover housing costs or other costs, really increased dramatically. And at that time, the orientation of policy efforts turned towards more emergency, covering emergency needs and temporary, with temporary measures. And it was at that time when the homeless provision sector somehow was became more consolidated in a way. It developed more firm tools. And it's in a way a kind of know-how and experience that has developed during that period, which is important. We still have a very limited public spending on housing, so this is an issue. If we want to develop a housing policy, we would need to invest as a society on that. So we would need to valorize it and acknowledge the need for putting more public money on that. in 2019, the first horizontal measure, housing support measure, was implemented. Until then, we didn't even have a rent benefit, so which is also impressive for European standards. But since 2019, there is a rent benefit. And by the latest data, it involves 245,000 beneficiaries, so it's quite broad. Another important, let's say, a component that adds to that is the introduction of a minimum income scheme, guaranteed minimum income scheme, which also includes homeless people, which is important. So homeless people can have access to some kind of income support. And this, at the latest data, again, it's for about 480,000 beneficiaries. The issue of household debt management continues to be a very important issue in housing policy, but we have, with the gradual liberalizations of the framework, which at the beginning was quite, let's say, supportive, we have passed from protecting primary residence, which was, and small property, which was one of the concerns at the beginning since 2009. There is somehow a development of a legal framework and mechanisms, mainly through the banks, to somehow support housing. So there are now some loan subsidies, not very developed yet. And there is, by the end of this year or at some time nearby, there will be a property acquisition body that will take the property of defaulted households and allow them to stay in their house with a rent. So this is very new things for the Greek reality. And we should also mention that there were important innovations within this year in supported the housing schemes through the private rental market, as I mentioned at the beginning. So where we are today, after a period of crisis, after, let's say, a kind of a track of economic recovery since 2017, motored particularly by tourism, we are now after 2 years of which were stopped abruptly by the pandemic. So many issues that had started to become important, and debates and discourses about the need, for example, to regulate the rental market, the need to control private investment in housing, the need to regulate short-term rentals as a tourist and entrepreneurial activity and not a housing, let's say, lease. All these debates somehow have been suspended in a way by this extraordinary and unprecedented situation we have been through. However, despite what was expected at the beginning, rents continue to increase and housing prices continue to increase, and this is an issue all over Europe and the world at this moment. Despite, again, the decrease in demand from tourism, let's say, investments continue in the real estate sector, and particularly in the housing stock. So we see it around us, the activity of refurbishment. We do have new, let's say, more professionalized players in the market, and a lot of foreign investment, either through more institutional investors, but also individual investors from foreign countries that see an opportunity in investing here. And this creates an immense pressure in the rental sector. which is important, as I said in the beginning, both for housing vulnerable groups and for implementing housing policies. And of course, there is a set of a broad, let's say, array of housing problems and housing precarities that is still enduring. Energy poverty is one of the crucial issues that, given also the situation in the energy market, will be very, very pressing. Youth housing in Greece is something that is not discussed or dealt with, but young people remain trapped, let's say, in their parents' homes for a long time, or face very precarious and difficult situations in accessing houses. Just to mention a few, we could have a big list. And in my opinion, the future of what has been developed and gained, let's say, through the previous years in policies for the homeless and refugees, you will hear much more from Dora after me, is uncertain. It's politically, financially uncertain in where it will go. And although important innovations were made with housing-led schemes, what seems to prevail in that direction is rather the consolidation of a more segregated and confinement approach for refugees, which also puts in question whether there will be, let's say, a more stable path for consolidating policies, more inclusive policies in cities and in the existing housing stock. So just to close, to sum up, let's say some seeds that we do have now for advancing a more coherent, a more integrated housing policy, for providing, let's say, more affordable and inclusive housing model. We do have to work with what there is. So the rent benefit for me is a very important gain, let's say, a very important addition in the policy tools that we do have now, and it has to be stabilized and expanded. We need to discuss again how to intervene in the rental housing market. This will be crucial in the following years, particularly for urban centers. The GMI scheme is an entry point to the social protection systems for many groups, and since it, let's say, refers to other services and systems, it is, let's say, a reform in the mechanism, the state mechanism that can be used and can be combined with other measures and tools. And we certainly do need to upscale and consolidate the know-how acquired from all these innovative programs that have been implemented. Of course, we start from, let's say, a very, very low level of state and administration mechanisms for all that. But there seems to be an interest from the local administrations towards that during the last years. There seems to be, let's say, a political engagement and a more systematic discussion about how municipalities can start developing local housing systems. Of course, this cannot be done from the local state on its own, particularly given that it does not have neither the lawmaking capacities and responsibilities nor resources for that. So it would have to be a multi-level governance scheme that develops. And we do have to develop ways to make use of resources we already have. All these vacant buildings, public property that might not be residential, but might be buildings that can be used for housing is there. It's something that comes again and again in discussions, policy discussions, movement claims. It's let's say, one of the assets we do have to find ways to make the best out of, and let's say the EU funding schemes for innovation is an opportunity for that, if we understand that giving money for an innovation has to be related with social goals, because it's not very obvious for everyone. So I stop here. Maybe I talk too much.
It's perfect.
And well, any questions? And of course, we will continue this discussion.
Yes, we have some questions. So before we go to Dora, I think just to stay focused on your presentation, let's go through the Q&A with you first, and then we can move on to Dora's presentation. So in the chat, you will see several questions, starting with one from me, which is, traditionally a lot of people say here in Greece, well, there's very high ownership, outright ownership. So we don't really need support, that's why we shouldn't have social housing really, because it's not so necessary as in other countries where there are many more people on the rental market. Do we have specific data on how much? I'm sure that this year's census will reveal a lot more data for sure. But do we have an indicative idea of the shift from outright ownership to the rental market?
Actually, the data I have here is the last data available from the income and living conditions, the EU Silk household living conditions of the EU. It's data from 2019. And what the main difference, it's not you don't have a time series here, but what has dramatically changed, or at least importantly in terms of statistics, is rather the ownership, the mortgage ownership, which has decreased from 15% to 8.3%. And this is impressive. And of course, you can explain it because banks are not giving loans, but for almost now 10, 11 years, lending for mortgage lending has stopped almost or fall down. But we do not have a big difference in rental. Rental is steadily 20%. Throughout the years. It somehow decreased during the crisis. At some point, it went to 70% in 2015, maybe reflecting practices of households to use their assets, their family assets. Maybe it's a question mark there. But we still have, if you add here the outright ownership, the mortgage ownership, and the provided for free, which is usually provided by family members, then you would have in property that is belongs to the broader family, you would have an 80% living in this, and the rental market would be 20%.
Okay. Do we have, Liat is asking if we have an idea of the amount of vacant housing, I guess.
Yes, I didn't bring here data. The last data, of course, we have is from the census of 2011, where Greece had almost a 35% of vacant housing. But for Eurostat, this includes second housing, holiday housing, and vacant housing for no use, and this was about 14%. So it looks there that 14% of the stock, and also if you see it, some studies that have analyzed the microdata, it's very much concentrated in large urban centers like Athens and Thessaloniki. They do have very higher percentages in the older parts, let's say, of the city. Of course, we also want to see what this census will bring, because it's been important, a turbulent, let's say, decade. And it would be interesting to see what will happen, although the methodology of the census is different. So anyway, however, we will have a more accurate and updated image of what is happening.
Okay, so Philip is asking, is it yet known to what extent has the pandemic led to an increase in homelessness, such as due to difficulties paying rent or mortgages? If so, has there been any policy interventions to address this?
Yeah, well, you put a lot of issues there, because it's homelessness when it's visible and extreme, but then it's rent arrears and mortgages. So there was an increase in homelessness, although it's not regularly documented. So we do not have a regular measuring methodology to follow what is happening, and what is happening particularly on the streets or in the more visible parts, or on demand from services. But throughout this previous decade, particularly the first years of the crisis, visible homelessness increased a lot. We would talk about new homeless at that time, those that were hit by economic hardship, difficulties, let's say. But we do not have data. And there was, I mean, the last measurement that happened here in Greece, where I was also involved from the part of the Ministry of Labor, was in 2018, where we tried to implement a methodology of night count, a point in time count in the streets and in services. And I have to, I don't remember the exact numbers now, but I can send you the results. I remember, if I remember well, in Athens, it was about, we counted about 700 people, homeless people, 360 of them in the streets. It was the time also where a lot of refugees would sleep in public spaces. But we do not have data what happens from evictions due to rent arrears. Again, this sector is not documented. And the issue, the mortgage issue has been contained in another way. Since 2009, there have been a moratorium in auctions, and there has been a quite, let's say, pro borrower insolvency law. But this has been gradually liberalized, but we didn't have the massive evictions that we saw in Spain. And to finish this this answer, there have been policy interventions, particularly in funding the development of services, of emergency, immediate housing services like shelters and temporary night shelters and temporary shelters. Andreas wants to say something, or it's by mistake? No, it's by mistake. Okay. So this field has, let's say, somehow expanded in big municipalities particularly. And we also have some schemes for housing-led schemes that have rented apartments from the private sector to house, like the housing and the reintegration program that also the municipality of Thessaloniki has implemented. So yes, there have been some interventions, but they have been, let's say, we have developed a know-how and an infrastructure, but how we will go on from now on, when this kind of pressure is not so obvious anymore. Visible homelessness maybe is not in the spotlight at this period, but there are other sides of housing difficulties that are there. And and certainly the organizations on the ground would know much more, as they were saying, about unaccompanied minors and refugees that are in the limbo, let's say, between a supportive framework and being let out on their own to find a house.
Okay, so Dimitra, thank you so much. There are several interesting questions, but because we have limited time, can I ask you to maybe respond in writing in the chat to some of the questions?
Okay, yes, I will try to.
I apologize for those who are asking for this, but we will have to move on to the next presentation, which will be focusing more on the refugee and asylum seeker aspect. And it's Dora Kokozidou, who is from the UNHCR. She's a municipal liaison officer, and she supports the municipality of Thessaloniki on the integration, on policies relating to integration of refugees and migrants.
Good morning from my side. Thank you very much, Merit, for inviting me. Let me share my screen and clarify that I will focus on the issue of refugee accommodation in apartments, the out-of-camp concept that UNHCR has been supporting for years, and I will present you what were the practices followed in Greece, and also refer a bit to the gap that was already mentioned by Dimitra between a protective reception system to nothing. UNHCR initiated the ESTIA program, Accommodation for Asylum Seekers, back in 2016. You all remember the big refugee flows in Greece back in 2015, 2016, until March 2016, when the Balkan route was closed. So UNHCR was invited by the Greek government to offer accommodation solutions to people that had to interrupt their journey to other European countries. So initially, UNHCR offered around 20,000 places in accommodation, mainly people participating in the relocation scheme that was implemented back then by the countries in the EU. So mainly asylum seekers that were eligible to be relocated in another European country. Together with accommodation, UNHCR initiated a cash assistance scheme that was offered to all asylum seekers, regardless of whether they were accommodated in apartments, in camps, or hotels. The ESTIA program was implemented, of course, with EU funding and in collaboration with the Greek government. You must take under consideration that people that were eligible to move from the refugee site to an apartment in the city were the most vulnerable of the asylum seekers. So the majority of the people, of the families or the single persons in the apartments faced at least either a serious medical condition, or there was a child at risk, or it was a single-headed household, mainly women with a lot of children. So despite the fact that the ESTIA was designed together with municipalities, of course, and NGOs as a reception program, offering mental health support, interpretation services, etc., it acquired some integration elements. The majority of the people, as you may see, accommodated in ESTIA came from the Syrian Republic, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And half of the people were underage, were up to 18 years old, and the adults were almost during the years half and half, women and men. So, as I mentioned before, it is, for me, it's very important to say that thanks to the enormous efforts of people that worked in this program, Estia acquired a lot of integration characteristics. People that were, families that lived in apartments sent their children to school. They acquired some necessary documentation in order to access public and municipal services. And of course, received a lot of help upon arrival in the apartment, like clothes, some basic orientation skills, etc. The CAS assistance program that I mentioned before was initiated a few months later in the spring of 2017. We used a system of prepaid cards per household. So the amount of money varied depending on the number of people in the family, and if the family was living in a catered facility, like a refugee site or a hotel, or in an apartment. The amount of money was agreed, of course, with the government, and as a basis, the social welfare system of Greece was considered, so that refugees were receiving an amount of money more equivalent to the minimum guaranteed income, back then social solidarity income it was called, that Dimitra mentioned. The maximum of the money provided was 490 euros. Now, after the transition of Estia program to the state, the maximum amount of money has reduced to 440 euros. As I said, since 2020, UNHCR has the program has transitioned from UNHCR coordination to the Ministry of Migration Policy, Migration and Asylum now. Also, as well as the CAS assistance program, the transition of this was a bit slower, and it was finally concluded now, last month, on the 30th of September. As of 1st of October, the state is in control both of the accommodation program and the CAS assistance program. It's worth saying, as you may see here, this is a summary of what happened, that the Estia program in apartments managed to reach the maximum number of places in Greece was 27,000. It was implemented all over Greece in 16 cities and 7 islands. While the accommodation residents overall, people that passed through lived in those apartments throughout their asylum procedure were 73,000. Here, I would also like to refer to the fact that in the context of Estia, 4,300 people, the most vulnerable, were also relocated to other European countries. Regarding recognized refugees, we see that the majority were Syrians, while currently the asylum seekers, the majority of the asylum seekers come from Afghanistan. I need to clarify here that the number of recognized refugees does not reflect the actual number of recognized refugees that are here in the country at the moment. You must have known that the current trend in Greece is, as soon as an asylum seeker receives the refugee status, tries to find a way to another European country, mainly in the north. According to the data that is published by the ministry, overall, we must have around 80,000 people in the country at the moment, mainly asylum seekers. What was initiated as a bridge from ESTIA, that was a program for asylum seekers, to an accommodation solution for recognized refugee, is ILIOS program. ILIOS is operated by the International Organization for Migration in Greece. It's a pilot project, and it was set up to address the needs of recognized refugees that are obliged to leave their apartments in a month after recognition. So ILIOS program offers rental subsidies, integration courses, employability support, etc., for a period that can last from 6 maximum to 12 months, again with the European funding, with a lot of eligibility criteria. I need to say that self-accommodated people cannot apply for ILIOS, so that asylum seekers that were hosted by friends or managed to find a job and rent a house are not eligible for ILIOS program. So applicants should be accommodated before in a refugee site or in ESTIA or in the other forms of accommodation for asylum seekers existing in Greece. And they need to apply within 12 months after recognition. So if someone is recognized as a refugee and within a year does not apply for ILIOS program, is excluded. As I told you, they offer some Greek language courses and soft skill modules. The truth is that now during COVID, distance learning did not work for ILIOS. So people received the rental subsidies, but in reality were unable to attend the Greek language courses. Whatever that means for their chances to get a job in Greece, etc., after the 6 months period is over. There are also some employability services offered. So the program has some job counseling services. People can visit the job counselor up to 5 and have up to 5 individual sessions. And other activities that should promote social cohesion and some integration monitoring. There are people working in ILIOS program that try to see if refugees are actually settling down, are looking for a job, or have enrolled their children to school, etc. Those are the numbers. Enrollments do not reflect people actually entering the programs. You see that the majority again come from Syria and Afghanistan. This data reflects what is actually happening. So currently we have almost 1,500 households benefiting from the ILIOS rental subsidies. The thing is, before I close my presentation with presenting the social welfare system in Greece and how this supports accommodation, is that we have the phenomenon of the homeless ILIOS graduates. So people finish this period of the 6 to 12 months, recognized refugees, but they are not able to keep their homes. They weren't able to find a job. And we have the striking phenomenon of people returning back to the site, to the refugee camp, in a tent outside. I want to refer to the social welfare system in Greece because, taking under consideration what Dimitra mentioned before, the lack of a housing policy in Greece, a lot of vulnerable Greeks depend on state support to pay the rent. So the Refugee Convention, the Geneva Convention, foresees that those rights should be exercised also by refugees in all countries. And under the Greek law also, under national law, social benefits theoretically are accessible also for beneficiaries of international protection. At a minimum, people should be able to submit specific documentation like their tax registration number, tax declarations, social security number, all these documents that someone must have in order to apply for social support in Greece. We have the minimum guaranteed income, which is one of the few benefits, social benefits in Greece that does not pre-require a specific time of legal and permanent residency before the application. But since both Estia cash assistance and Ilios rental subsidy is perceived as an income, people should wait at least 6 months before applying for the minimum guaranteed income. So me as a recognized refugee, initially exiting Estia and then entering Ilios, my 6-month period is over. I didn't find a job. I cannot apply for the minimum guaranteed income. So this no or very low income requirement, according to the law that describes the minimum guaranteed income, usually is fulfilled 6 months after the end of their entitlements. As Dimitra mentioned, homeless persons can apply for this minimum guaranteed income as long as they can acquire a certificate of homeless by their municipality. People that stay in refugee, as I described before, outside the refugee camp in a tent, or are hosted by a friend, or live in squats, more probably they will not be able to apply. They will not be able to gather the documentation needed and apply. The housing allowance, the rent benefit that Dimitra mentioned before, is open to beneficiaries of international protection, is open to third country national. Of course, you need to present a lease agreement in order to receive it, but you need also to prove that you live in Greece for 5 consecutive years prior to the application. And this in Greece is only proved by 5 years of tax declarations. I don't think that there is a recognized refugee, at least one that arrived in Greece after 2015, that was able to apply. Very few would be able to present. No one. They all newly recognized beneficiaries cannot apply for this allowance. Another allowances that are given to the most vulnerable people in Greece also exclude beneficiaries of international protection for the same reason. Like the birth allowance, you need to prove 7 years of legal and permanent residency in Greece before applying. And this 7-year period, starting from 2024, will be a 12-year period. The child allowance also requires a 5-year residence in Greece, also should be proved through a tax declaration. So again, people of international that beneficiaries of international protection are not explicitly excluded, but in reality they cannot access these benefits that can reach the number of 93 euros per child. So it's a very important source of income for people that are unemployed or have no other source of income. There is also an income for people that have reached the age of 67 years old, which is the most common limit in Greece for someone to apply and receive their pension. Those people that do not have enough years of employment to receive a pension, they can receive this allowance when they turn 67 if they can prove that they have been in Greece for 15 years. 15. The disability benefits, together with the minimum guaranteed income, it is also a type of social assistance scheme that does not pre-require a long residence in Greece before, but it's a very complicated procedure, especially for someone that doesn't speak Greek, a very long procedures, and beneficiaries of international protection can apply if they can present a residence permit, a social security number, all these documents that I have mentioned before. As UNHCR, with the exception of the minimum guaranteed income and a few people that applied and received the disability allowance, we are not aware of any beneficiary of international protection in Greece that managed to receive any other social benefit. Therefore, after the conclusion of the programs that I mentioned before, the vast majority of people are faced with nothing, with no social assistance, something that can secure their accommodation. Thank you very much.
Dora, thank you very, very much. It's quite dark, actually, when you listen to this.
It is, unfortunately.
Yes, and we can see that in the absence of access to the very minute horizontal measures that Dimitra was mentioning as well, like the minimum income or some of the other social benefits, combined with the fact that also we saw in Dimitra's presentation the increase in the levels of rent and energy costs for housing and cost overburden, let's say, of housing. This puts the refugees under a very high risk, let's say, group in the country. We don't have data at the moment in terms of, let's say, because legally in Greece, homelessness is not defined through the ethos light typology. So, but if we did define it with that typology, it would be huge. I mean, it would be the majority of the refugee population. And we know that, as Dora mentioned, because of the high costs of housing, first of all, they find it very difficult to find housing. So housing is very overcrowded, even if they have the rent subsidy, meaning that several refugees come together and rent a small house and share the housing cost. So it's an overcrowded house. And usually after the end of the subsidies, leave and go back to the camp, which is, you can imagine, it is, yeah, it's a state of homelessness. So I know that we are beyond time. I thought that we wouldn't be, but we are. 10 minutes.
No, Merit, we can also take one question, I think, if there's any.
It would be nice to see if anyone has a question before we go on to a break. No questions? Okay, well, I could have a question, but I'm not going to do it. So we can all have a coffee.
It was fascinating and a lot of information. And as you said, also, especially at the end, quite upsetting to hear, but very, very interesting.
Erich, what's your question?
No, it's not a question, it's a comment, actually. I mean, we, as in the agency, we're implementing the Greek language module of the Ilios program. So we do Greek language courses. And I have to say that we have very, very big difficulties in keeping our beneficiaries, which means there's a huge turnover. We lose them and we find them in Germany. We find them in all kinds of other European countries. Like after a week, we're like, why are you not coming to class? Well, I'm in Düsseldorf, you know. It's and it's not a surprise in the end. I mean, Ilios is a pilot project, which is going to be more of a permanent project run by the ministry, but obviously it's not enough, especially when refugees are not integrated generally into the welfare system equally as with other citizens.
I think what you say is exactly the point. Not only the welfare, of course, but lacking an integration policy that starts from day one and follows people during their asylum process, starting learning Greek after 5 years in the country, or receiving employability for just 6 months. Trust me, you cannot learn Greek in 6 months. Or receiving employability services that are so limited. It's it's mathematically certain that people have decided even before the decision is delivered to them that they will leave Greece for another country.
Yes, so on this positive note, I guess we can go on for a break.
Yes, I would suggest that we keep, so now it's 11:43, maybe we can keep like almost 10 minutes break if it's okay for you, so that we have enough time afterwards. So it's gonna be like a 2-song break. And we're back just before 12, okay?
I'd like to thank again all the speakers, Mr. Koukas, Nana, Dimitra, Dora, for being here, and everybody else for following, of course. And
thank you so much. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really,
so,
a good view to
11:50?
Thessaloniki.
Yeah, 11:50 back then, or?
Yes, that would be fantastic. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.